Paul McCown walked into the Huntington Bank branch in Brooklyn, Ohio, clutching his first paycheck from a new job at an electric company. It was December 2018, cold wind, gray skies, and a quiet sense of pride. He had just started turning his life around. A new job. A fresh start. A simple task. Cash a check worth about $1,000. But within minutes, that ordinary moment would unravel into something darker, something humiliating, painful, and all too familiar for many Black Americans. Because instead of cashing his check, the teller called 911. What happened inside that small-town bank that day wasn't just about a paycheck. It was about perception, about suspicion, and about what it means to be Black in spaces that still quietly question your right to belong. Paul wasn't a criminal. He wasn't trying to scam anyone. He had paperwork, identification, and even followed every bank protocol. But as he stood at the counter, the teller looked at the check, hesitated, and something shifted. In her eyes, doubt. In her tone, distance. Minutes later, while Paul waited for the transaction to go through, the teller's voice crackled quietly into a phone line, but not to verify his employment. She was calling 911. On the recorded call, later obtained by CNN, the bank employee's voice is calm, polite, almost procedural. "I have a customer here," she says. Then pauses. "He's not our customer, actually. He's trying to cash a check, and the check is fraudulent. It does not match our records." There's no panic. No evidence of danger. Just certainty that this Black man, with his own paycheck in hand, must be lying. By the time Paul stepped outside, empty-handed, 2 police officers were waiting. He remembers their eyes. The cold metal of handcuffs closing around his wrists. The rush of humiliation as they placed him in the back of a cruiser, in full view of everyone passing by. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't resisted. But the damage, the humiliation, had already been done. At that moment, Paul McCown wasn't an employee trying to cash a paycheck. He was a suspect. A Black man under suspicion, for earning, for existing, for daring to step into a bank. When officers questioned him, he tried to stay calm. He explained that the check came from his new job at an electric company. He even gave them his supervisor's contact information. But when the officers called the employer, no one answered. And so, the suspicion lingered. Inside the bank, tellers justified their decision as routine caution. But outside, a man's dignity was quietly being stripped away. Minutes turned into half an hour. Half an hour turned into nearly an hour. Finally, when the police reached Paul's employer, the truth emerged. The check was real. The job was real. And everything about the accusation had been wrong. The officers released him. No charges. No crime. Just an apology from the bank, claiming that tellers were being hypervigilant after a series of fraudulent checks. Paul walked away, no longer handcuffed, but still chained to something invisible. Later, he went to a different Huntington Bank branch and cashed the exact same check without any problem. "It was highly embarrassing," he said at the time. "The person who made that phone call, that manager, that teller, whoever made that phone call, I feel as though they were judging." His story could have ended there, as just one man's painful experience. But it didn't. Because what happened to Paul McCown wasn't rare. It was part of a disturbing pattern. Across the United States, countless Black Americans have shared similar stories. Stories that begin with everyday errands and end with police lights flashing. They call it banking while Black. An invisible crime. A quiet humiliation repeated in lobbies and teller lines across the country. There's no national data. No official record. But the stories keep surfacing, one after another. Florida civil rights attorney Yechezkel Roddle says he hears about these cases all the time. "After my client sued a bank 2 years ago," he said, "I started getting calls from Black people all over the nation. People who were questioned, doubted, or outright accused when they tried to deposit or cash their own money. Some cases end in lawsuits or quiet settlements. Others fade into silence. But behind every one of those stories is the same painful question. Would this have happened if they weren't black? In McCown's case, even after the truth came out, the sting of what happened lingered. He had done everything right. 2 forms of identification. A fingerprint. A professional demeanor. And still, suspicion won. Paul's story made national headlines. But it was only the beginning. Because within months, another name would appear. Another man, another bank, another moment of disbelief. His name was Bendrick Watson. And his experience would go even deeper. Bendrick Watson was a Florida lawyer and entrepreneur, educated, confident, and successful. He already had a personal account at Wells Fargo. But one afternoon near Tampa, he walked into a branch to open a business account for his law firm. He expected routine paperwork. Instead, he found himself face to face with the ugliest kind of reality. As the banker looked through Watson's records, something caught his attention. He noticed that Watson also owned a record label. Instead of curiosity, there was doubt. The questions turned sharp. What kind of business is this? Are you sure you own it? Watson felt the shift instantly, that subtle, suffocating air of suspicion. The banker left and brought in the branch manager. The manager began scrolling through Watson's information, double-checking and cross-referencing. Watson waited patiently. Then, out of nowhere, the manager looked up and said a word. A single, vile word. The N-word. Watson froze. His mind couldn't process what he'd just heard. My jaw just literally dropped, he later told CNN. I was scared. I said, did he really say that? He sat back in disbelief as the manager fumbled through an apology, calling it a slip of the tongue. But the damage was done. Watson gathered his things and walked out, shaken, angry, humiliated. When you go to the bank, your guard is down, he said. You don't expect to be called a racist word. I was a customer in this bank. I had been to this bank. It physically hurts. For him, this wasn't about a single insult. It was about what it revealed. How fragile the promise of equality really is, even in 2024. His attorney, Yechezkel Rodel, contacted the bank. Soon after, a regional manager sent Watson a letter apologizing for the unacceptable incident. The letter admitted what happened was wrong, even if the bank claimed it was unintentional. Wells Fargo does not tolerate that kind of language, the manager wrote. We have taken corrective action against the former branch manager. The words sounded formal, corporate, sterile. But behind them was a raw human wound. In a statement to CNN, Wells Fargo said the manager had resigned as the bank was preparing to fire him. He was marked as not eligible for rehire. The bank added, we are very sorry and deeply apologize to him for what must have been a horrible experience. A horrible experience. That's one way to describe being called a slur inside a place where you came to open a business account. Watson's story reignited the conversation about race and finance. About the quiet ways systemic racism shows up, not always as violence, but as humiliation, disbelief, and exclusion. While Watson's story unfolded in Florida, hundreds of miles away, another man was preparing to step into a bank, unaware that he too would be accused of fraud for simply being black. His name was Sontor Thomas. And his story, like McCown's, began with a check. It was January 2020. Sontor walked into a TCF bank branch in Livonia, Michigan. He was there to open a savings account and deposit checks from a legal settlement. The irony? The settlement itself was from a racial discrimination case against his former employer. Now, he was about to face discrimination again, this time from the very institution that should have protected his financial rights. As he handed over the checks, the teller's face tightened. She asked how he got the money. Then, she called the police. In minutes, 4 officers arrived. 4 armed men, to question a customer trying to deposit his own checks. His attorney, Deborah Gordon, later said, something else was afoot here. And in my opinion, there's only one thing: banking while black. Thomas had done nothing wrong. His money was legal. His checks were legitimate. But to that teller, his skin color was enough to raise suspicion. After the chaos, Thomas left. He went to a different bank, opened a new account, and deposited the same checks without a single problem. The contrast was stunning. In one branch, police were called. In another, professionalism prevailed. When the story broke, TCF Bank issued a statement: local police should not have been involved. We strongly condemn racism and discrimination of any kind. They called the incident an unfortunate mistake. But to Thomas, it wasn't a mistake. It was a reminder that even when justice is paid out in a check, the systems that created the injustice remain. He later met with the bank's board chairman, who assured him the incident didn't represent how the company does business. But for millions of Black Americans, these apologies sound painfully familiar. Because they come after the damage is done, after the humiliation, after the handcuffs, after the word fraudulent echoes in the air for everyone to hear. Civil rights lawyers say these incidents are difficult to fight legally. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in hotels, theaters, and restaurants, but not banks. That gap means many victims of banking while Black have little federal protection. Attorney Deborah Gordon said, "This act was written in the middle of the civil rights movement. The focus was on lunch counters, motels, and public spaces. Banks weren't on the list." Some states, like Michigan, have since passed broader civil rights laws. But across much of the U.S., racial profiling inside banks remains a gray area, one where justice often depends on media attention or corporate apologies. And even then, the trauma lingers. Because once you've been handcuffed, questioned, or insulted in a bank, you never walk through those glass doors the same way again. In the wake of George Floyd's killing in 2020, pressure mounted on corporations to confront systemic racism. Banks issued statements, pledged diversity programs, and launched unconscious bias training. But for many, those words feel hollow. Because the reality inside many branches hasn't changed enough. U.S. Bank's Chief Diversity Officer Greg Cunningham admitted it bluntly. As a company based in Minneapolis, he said, "We had to ask ourselves how we could help change the systemic inequities, socially and financially, that have contributed to what was a recurring tragedy." He urged companies to not just apologize, but to build meaningful relationships with Black-owned businesses and take concrete steps to earn trust. Wells Fargo followed with promises of its own. CEO Charlie Scharf announced mandatory live programs to tackle discrimination, programs beyond the standardized training that is inadequate to the challenge. He said the company would use incidents like Watson's to teach fairness, empathy, and accountability. But the question remains, will it be enough? Even TCF Bank, after the Sontor Thomas case, rolled out new bias training and reviewed its internal policies. They said they wanted to ensure equal treatment of all customers. But for the people who've lived it, McCown, Watson, Thomas, the harm is already permanent. No training can erase that memory. These stories aren't just about banks. They're about trust. The moment someone doubts your worth, your honesty, your humanity, not because of your actions, but because of your color, that trust fractures. And when that happens in a place that handles your money, your future, your stability, it cuts deeper. Paul McCown still remembers the feeling of sitting in that police car. The cold seat. The stares from strangers walking by. All because a teller couldn't imagine that a Black man might earn an honest paycheck worth $1,000. He said later, "It was highly embarrassing." But what he didn't say, what many understand without words, is that it was more than embarrassing. It was dehumanizing. Every apology sounds the same. Every company promises change. And every year, new stories surface, new victims of the same quiet, systemic suspicion. Banking while Black isn't a slogan. It's an indictment of a system that still doesn't see everyone the same way. Paul's story might have ended there, a headline that faded after a week. But in the years that followed, more names, more faces, and more recordings surfaced, exposing how deep the problem runs. And as pressure grew, some banks began hiring crisis consultants, forming diversity task forces, and even firing staff caught in racial profiling incidents. But behind closed doors, another battle was brewing. Because while banks were promising reform, victims, and civil rights lawyers were uncovering new evidence. Proof that racial bias in the financial industry wasn't just a matter of individual prejudice. It was systemic, structured, and hidden beneath layers of policies, algorithms, and risk assessments. And when one man in Michigan decided to take his case even further, digging into the data behind how banks profile transactions, what he found would expose something much bigger than anyone expected. Something that could shake the entire industry. After the stories of Paul McCown, Bendrick Watson, and Santor Thomas went viral, public outrage began to grow. But behind that outrage was something much deeper, something that went far beyond a few bad employees or isolated mistakes. There was a pattern, a structure, a system quietly designed to question one group more than others. When Michigan resident Santor Thomas settled his case and tried to move on, his attorney, Deborah Gordon, began digging into bank data, looking for patterns in fraud reporting, police calls, and customer verification procedures. What she discovered was chilling. Black customers, regardless of income level, were being flagged at higher rates for fraud risk than white customers with identical account activity. And it wasn't random. Hidden inside banking algorithms were systems trained on decades of biased data, old records, skewed demographics, and risk scores that quietly punished people for living in predominantly black neighborhoods. If your zip code had a certain pattern, your transaction might be delayed. If your ID photo didn't match exactly due to lighting or age, your check could be flagged. The systems were automated, but the bias was built in. When Gordon presented her findings, she said, "This isn't just a few tellers. It's coded discrimination, a machine version of the same human suspicion that's been here for generations." Her words hit like a thunderclap in the legal community. Because it meant banking while black wasn't just cultural, it was structural. And proving it would require going up against some of the most powerful financial institutions in America. Meanwhile, other cases were quietly surfacing. In Atlanta, a black woman trying to withdraw money from her account was detained after the teller said her signature didn't look right. In Texas, a retired Navy veteran was questioned about a loan payment he'd already made, because the bank couldn't confirm his employment. Each case was dismissed as an isolated incident. Each apology sounded rehearsed. But the pain was collective. Civil rights attorney Yechezkel Rodel called it the modern form of redlining. He said banks once denied loans in black neighborhoods. Now, they deny legitimacy, assuming fraud where there is none. He described it as financial gatekeeping disguised as caution. And for those who experience it, the result is the same: exclusion, embarrassment, and loss of trust. Experts began to analyze what happens psychologically when someone is racially profiled in a bank. It's not just embarrassment. It's identity erosion, a moment when a system tells you, you don't belong here. For some, it creates anxiety about money, fear of transactions, even avoidance of financial institutions altogether. That means less banking, less credit, less growth. And the cycle continues. For Paul McCown, it took months before he could even step into a bank without a wave of anxiety. He later said that every teller glance felt loaded, every delay felt suspicious. And that's the hidden cost of discrimination. Not just what it takes away in the moment, but what it takes away long after the moment is over. After the murder of George Floyd in 2020, financial institutions faced unprecedented public pressure. For the first time, CEOs were being asked tough questions, not just about who they hire, but who they serve. Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, US Bank, all issued glossy press releases promising equity and change. They pledged millions toward black-owned businesses and diversity training. But to many, it felt like déjà vu. Because when people like Bendrick Watson or Santor Thomas looked back, they saw a pattern of promises made after headlines, and forgotten once the outrage faded. Apologies don't fix policy, Watson said. They don't rebuild trust. They just put a band-aid on a bullet wound. In interviews, he described his lawsuit not as revenge, but as a mission. "I'm not suing for money," he said. "I'm suing because I want them to change. I want the next young black man who walks into that branch to be treated like a customer, not a suspect. His words began to echo online, shared across Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. Millions of people commented, recounting their own banking while black experiences. The floodgates had opened. Civil rights lawyers began collaborating, comparing case files, and sharing data. They noticed how many incidents ended the same way: a call to the police, a temporary detention, an apology, then silence. The law simply wasn't built to protect these victims. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had addressed public accommodations, theaters, motels, restaurants. But banks weren't on that list. Deborah Gordon called it a fatal omission. She said, "We've outlawed discrimination where people eat and sleep, but not where they save, build, and dream." It was a loophole large enough to drive an armored truck through, and banks knew it. That's why, for decades, lawsuits against them rarely succeeded in federal court. The law wasn't written to see banking as a public accommodation, even though for most people, access to banking is as essential as access to food or shelter. In legal terms, the system was blind. In human terms, it was complicit. But as the public conversation deepened, some banks started confronting their own internal cultures. U.S. Bank's diversity chief Greg Cunningham admitted that progress wasn't just about training, it was about accountability. "Bias doesn't vanish because you had a workshop," he said. "It vanishes when people know they'll be held responsible for their actions." Meanwhile, internal memos from several banks leaked online, showing executives warning employees about the growing risk of reputational damage from racial profiling incidents. Some branches quietly changed their procedures. Tellers were told to verify checks through corporate channels before calling police. Employees had to log every 911 call and justify it. It was a small step, but it revealed a truth: they knew it was happening. By 2022, the conversation had shifted. Major banks began funding research on racial equity in finance. But critics said it was still performative, that funding a study is not the same as changing behavior. Civil rights groups demanded federal intervention. They wanted new legislation, something to close the loophole left by the 1964 Act. A few lawmakers listened. Most didn't. But something else was changing. The internet had become a courtroom of its own. Every viral video, every public lawsuit, every leaked apology, it all lived online, permanently. Banks couldn't bury their mistakes anymore. And one viral moment could undo years of public trust. That's what happened again in 2023, when another incident caught national attention. A black small business owner in Georgia recorded a teller accusing him of check fraud, even after he presented full documentation. He posted the video online. Within hours, it had over 5 million views. The caption read, "Banking while black." Again. The comments flooded in. Thousands of people sharing their own stories. That viral moment reignited interest in Paul McCown's story. Reporters revisited the 911 recording. Podcasts dissected the call second by second. One journalist described the teller's tone as calm suspicion, the kind that doesn't scream hatred but whispers prejudice. That's what made it so dangerous. It wasn't overt racism. It was ordinary racism, the kind that hides behind policy and professionalism. For McCown, watching the renewed attention was bittersweet. He told CNN that he still felt uneasy every time he drove past a Huntington Bank branch. Even though the company had apologized, the trust was gone. "It changes the way you see people," he said softly. "The way you see yourself." Racial discrimination in banking isn't always loud. It's not always violent. But it's corrosive. It eats at self-worth, dignity, and belonging. For every headline, there are hundreds of untold stories. People who choose silence because they don't want to make a scene. People who walk away, thinking, maybe it's just me. But it's not just them. It's a system built on invisible walls. Even now, in 2025, lawyers like Roddle and Gordon say they still get calls every month. A man detained for cashing a bonus check. A woman questioned about her business account. A teenager denied a savings deposit for security reasons. Different cities. Same story. And every time, the same phrase repeats itself: I just wanted to cash my check. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to look at the roots. Historically, banks in America were designed for exclusion. From redlining in the 1930s to loan discrimination in the 1980s, financial systems were built on separating risk by race, a practice justified as economics but rooted in prejudice. Those old patterns never vanished. They evolved. Today's algorithms are the new red lines. Instead of denying mortgages, they deny trust. Instead of blocking loans, they block legitimacy. It's racism written in code, invisible, efficient, and devastating. But awareness is growing. Grassroots campaigns like #BankBlack are urging people to support black-owned banks and credit unions. Community institutions are seeing new deposits, new energy, new pride. As one organizer said, if they won't respect us in their banks, we'll build our own. It's not revenge. It's resilience. Back in Ohio, the Huntington Bank branch where Paul McCown was detained eventually retrained its staff. The manager involved quietly left. The company moved on. But Paul didn't forget. And neither did the people who saw themselves in his story. His case remains a symbol, not because it was unique, but because it was ordinary. Because it revealed how something so small, a glance, a doubt, a phone call, can destroy someone's sense of belonging. All over a paycheck worth $1,000. Every time a black customer is profiled in a bank, the same story repeats itself. A system designed to serve, instead, suspects. A space meant for trust, instead, suspicion. And yet, people keep walking in. Because they have to. Because money is power, and exclusion from it is a silent sentence. Civil rights experts now say it's time for Congress to act, to expand the Civil Rights Act to include financial institutions, giving victims legal standing to sue under federal law. Without that, banking while black will remain a cultural issue, not a criminal one. Some say the tide is slowly turning. Younger bank employees are more aware. Training is improving. Diversity hiring is up. But others aren't convinced. Because for every policy change, there's another viral video, another apology, another man in handcuffs outside a branch. And that's the real crime here. Not theft. Not fraud. But dignity was stolen in plain sight. No headline, no lawsuit, no press release can undo that. Paul McCown once said, "The person who made that phone call, I feel as though they were judging." He didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just told the truth. A quiet truth that millions understand. Banking while black isn't a headline, it's a sentence. One written in suspicion, enforced by policy, and lived by those who refuse to stop walking through the door. Because every deposit, every paycheck, every transaction is a declaration. I belong here. And no amount of systemic bias can take that away. Paul McCown's story was supposed to end with an apology. Instead, it became a mirror, forcing America to look at the systems it built, the bias it coded, and the justice it still owes. He just wanted to cash a check. But what he exposed was a nation still struggling to cash in on its own promise of equality.